Good morning, everybody. Welcome to a beautiful and brand new day. Here in the Enchanted Forest, it's warm and a little almost summery feeling. It's a beautiful thing. All of the gardens around the Enchanted Forest and the School of Sacred Studies are beginning to bloom. And it feels really, really good to be able to open up the windows and listen to the birds chirping out in the forest. It's a gorgeous day, and I hope that wherever you happen to be, you're also having a beautiful, beautiful day. Howdy, Rob. Hey, Janet. Good morning, Kimberly. It is great to see you all in the chat room. For those of you that are hanging out there and you're wondering, can I get in the chat room? You sure can. Please go to Spreaker and join us. And welcome. Yeah, and if you would be so kind as to like the show and to follow the show on Spreaker, I would appreciate it. It helps to get the shows distributed to a wider audience. So thank you for doing that, everybody. This morning on Exploring Sacred, what about those sacred winds of opposition, right? The opposing forces that sometimes show up or blow up into our lives. And I think that we can safely say that most of us have experienced that. And sometimes it's something that isn't taught, it's something that's learned, usually learned through the school of hard knocks. And sometimes by surprise, when we discover where the winds of opposition are blowing in from, or who sent them our way, or what sent them, or why they were sent, or why they're happening. I know a lot of times when people begin the deep dive into their spiritual path or their spirituality or their ancestry, not much is really taught about the times when opposition will show up. And, you know, that opposition comes to us in many forms. It affects us in many ways. And when we're not prepared for it, it can be shocking. Can be absolutely shocking, particularly if it's something out of our paradigm to be an oppositional person. Some people just love to be oppositional. They like to oppose everything. They like to challenge everything. They like to, seek attention by being oppositional. And then there are those and we normally know who those people are in our lives that are always the oppositional person. The attention seeker, the one with the inner child that really hasn't grown out of, look at me, look at me, look at me, look at how well I can oppose everything, right? That's a whole other show. I'm talking about, what about the opposing forces that show up to teach us? How do they show up? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. Next week, our dear friend Terry Ruel, who was supposed to be on at 11 o'clock this morning. She had something come along in her life, so she needed to reschedule her show to next week. She's going to be talking about gaslighting. Gaslighting is one of those oppositional forces that can come our way to test our mettle. And first and foremost, how do we find our center? How do we find our center when opposition appears? I say when it blows in. Sometimes it blows in like a storm, and other times it's kind of a whisper that blows in. Subtle at first. And it gains momentum, builds up a head of steam. How do we find our center? What is our center? Okay, that's the conversation for today. I think it'll be a good one. Okay, hey, Linda Grezak, Angie, Holly, good to have you in the chat room. So first and foremost, how do we find our center when this stuff happens? When opposition shows up? Where does it show up from? Maybe we should begin there. Well, it can show up from people, and we've already talked about people who are just oppositional. And we can set boundaries with those people in our lives. They don't have to be welcome just because they exist, right? So having boundaries is good when we have those types of people in our lives. And it's amazing how often we forget about boundaries in our spiritual life. In our spiritual life. Opposition comes from people. It can be born out of ego. It can be born out of jealousy. It can be born out of challenging. Right? Have you ever had an oppositional force appear in your life as a challenge from another person along the spiritual path? Right? My powers are greater than your powers. Watch and see. That kind of a thing. Have you ever had oppositional forces show up from the subtle realms in your dream time? Sometimes it's the dreamscape that finds us dealing with oppositional forces that are testing our mettle. What about oppositional forces that appear in our own mind? Sometimes we are the greatest oppositional person in our lives, right? We're always opposing ourselves. What do we do about that voice? Well, I think we have to have boundaries with that voice as well. That aspect of us that's always oppositional. Sometimes there's gratuitous opposition. And then there's opposition that shows up to teach us something about ourselves. Maybe it shows up to teach us about our worth. Maybe it shows up to teach us about inner strength. Maybe it shows up to teach us that we don't think highly enough of our own innate abilities, self-doubt. Sometimes it shows up to show us that we aren't all that in a bag of chips and we still have some things to learn. Well, that's a doozy, isn't it? It's those spiritual lipstick on the teeth and toilet paper on the shoe moments when the oppositional forces show up and we go, oh, I guess I don't know as much as I think I knew, or as I think I know. Oppositional forces can show up as contrarians in the spiritual corridors. Oppositional forces can show up to say, you know what you're doing is wrong. It's wrong. It doesn't fit into my paradigm of spirituality or religion, and therefore it's wrong. That's opposition. What do you do with that? Opposition can show up in subtle forms of the old eyebrow raising. And you're doing what now? Have you lost your mind? Tests along the way. It doesn't always fall into the category of spirituality. Oppositional forces. What do we do with that? Janet is saying, I was just about to say that. That's happening to me now as I have a big decision I'm trying to make. Yeah. Rob is saying I'm experiencing that right now, and it's not even really my fight. Sometimes things find us. You are right on about that, Rob. Oppositional forces. Long time ago, I was sitting with my spiritual director at the Dominican Center. Oh my goodness, almost 30 years ago now. Yikes. And she said to me, you know, Denise, the opposing forces are going to test you. They're going to test you a lot. They're going to test you to see just how strong you are in your spiritual beliefs, in your beliefs in yourself, your beliefs in creator and creation. And I said, well, Charm, why? Why does that have to happen? You know, when you're 30, we think we know a lot when we're 30. And then we get to be almost 60 and we think, oh my goodness, and I thought I knew a lot when I was 30. I didn't know nothing. Because sometimes I feel like I don't know nothing at almost 60, right? But Charm, why? And she said, sometimes our spiritual mettle needs to be tested before we're ready for the next level of our spirituality. Sometimes our spiritual mettle needs to be tested before we're presented with the next level of, or the next series of teachings about life. Maybe we're not ready, and we go headlong into what's next. I said, well, it's funny that you say that, Charm. On this particular day, I was driving to see Charmaine at the Dominican Center, which was maybe 2 miles, maybe 2.5 miles from my job at the newspaper. And my brand new car died in the middle of Michigan Hill, now known as the Medical Mile in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It just died. Just died. And I said to her, funny you should say that. My brand new car died right in the middle of coming to see you today so we could have this conversation. And she said, well, of course it did. Of course it did. But you got here. You were a couple of minutes late. It didn't stop you. For some people, when the winds of opposition show up, it stops them. And I said, well, isn't that a good thing if it stops you at least for a moment? Because what do you do in that moment that opposition shows up? Do you just go headlong, by God, I'm going to do this anyway? Or do you stop for a moment? I'm a person who stops for a minute. I do a little bit of a check-in. Am I not supposed to do this? Am I not supposed to go? Have I lost my mind? Or am I just being challenged? And who is it that's challenging me? Is it my higher self? Is it my soul self? Is it my ancestors? Is it Beelzebub and Beelzebub's minions? What is it? Is it my own inner doubting Thomas that's showing up in opposition? Because thoughts do become things. So when I have an opposing force, as I did that day, I sat there for a half a minute there, stuck in the traffic on Michigan Hill. And I wondered, am I supposed to go any further? If I'm supposed to go any further with any of this, as this 30-year-old woman that's having something happening, this awakening, maybe I'm as awake as I'm supposed to get. Or maybe I'm just being challenged in this moment to see how bad I want to go further into the deep. Geez, just give me a sign. Somebody. And the moment that I said that, I tried the key in the ignition, back in the day when you had to have a key in the ignition. And the brand new car started back up and the radio came on and the song that was playing was Cherokee People. And I thought, well, that's a good one. Okay. I think the ancestors are telling me keep going. That's how I intuited it. And I went. And I had this conversation about opposing forces with Charmaine, who then said, every day of your life, the darkness or the opposing forces is going to nip at your heels, which was a very uncomfortable thing for me to hear. And sometimes the nipping at the heels is gossip about, well, do you know what Denise is up to now? Or did you hear what Dana did? Or blah, 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 gossip. That can be an opposing force. And as you get older, gossip is gossip. Sometimes gossip turns into malfeasance, a character assassination. It can build. The wind of opposition can build. And the more people that breathe life into that form of spiritual opposition, into gossip, people who breathe life into that gossip, well, they become part of, what I talked about on my last show about ugliness and spirituality. We breathe into the belly of that beast. And if you're the person who is at the center of that kind of opposition, of the gossip kind, or maybe you're somebody who loves to get in on the juicy tidbits and perpetuate it, or not, become part of the tidal wave. I hope none of you are that way. But you're breathing life into an opposing force and you're becoming part of it. You're becoming part of the spirit of a larger thing. Well, did you hear? Did you hear? Did you hear? Well, I was told. Do you realize that when you become part of that, when you participate in that, you become part of a larger entity that has been born? And that you are breathing life into that entity, an opposing force. That doesn't get talked about much in the hallways of spiritual teaching and learning. And even if you're not the originator, you're not the first person to say, well, did you hear about so-and-so? When the winds blow back, because they do, and you wonder, well, why did I get caught up in all of that? Because you were part of the larger entity that came to life. Yes, an egregore is another word for that, Rob. Absolutely. Janet is saying, I think I need to ask for a sign. Hey, Jessica Clark. Yes, Kimberly, sometimes it does appear as anxiety. Hey, Laura, welcome to the chat room. It does show up as anxiety, the opposing force. You can feel it, or you can intuit, your gut intuits it. Sometimes I think it comes along to help us to remember to find our center. Good morning, Kelly Spencer. You are right, Robin. Egregore does take on a life of its own. It sure does. Sometimes you need to be as oppositional as the BS opposing you. That's not the same as counterattack. That simply escalates. Yeah. But cut the shit and cut it now. Absolutely, Rob. Yeah. Sometimes we are brought to that point. Knock it off. Just knock it off. And sometimes we have to wait, it seems, until it's a gale force wind, right? Our hair's blown back. And then we say, knock it off. But we don't have to do that. Oppositional forces, whether they're in the unseen world testing us. I've encountered oppositional forces in learning about carrying that pipe that I carry and being trained in the ceremonies of, the Inipi and such. It's called Heyoka, contrarian teachings. The contrarian teachings, when they come to us, teach us, number one, to find our center. For me, finding my center, if I'm here in the Enchanted Forest, it means going outside. I love to be outdoors. I will take being outdoors than being indoors any day. I love the outdoors, always have. It's medicine for me. And if it's just not available for me or not good for me to be outdoors, I find a quiet space here in my sacred space, in my home. And I center myself. I breathe. Take a minute. Where is this coming from? Who is this coming from? And who do I gather with me in my center? My ancestors, the well ones, the illuminated ones, I gather them to me. Come, sit with me. I call to my illuminated ancestors, the wise ones, to come sit with me. I call to my guardian angels and my allies. I call to the Christed light. Help me to find my center in the middle of this storm, in the middle of my doubtfulness. I can't see. I can't hear. Because the opposing winds, the chatter of my mind is just too much in this moment. Help me to calm those winds. The winds, the thoughts, the energy of thoughts, the energy of emotion, those winds, right? They can become like whirlwinds in our mind. Ancestors, come and sit with me. Help me to find my center in the middle of this chaos. And I breathe. And sometimes I will visualize, my feet becoming roots deep into Grandmother Earth. If I can't be outside laying on Grandmother Earth or snuggled up to a tree. Right? Some people find their center. They'll go into a church and they'll sit in a pew, or, they find a place of sacred. How do you do that when you're at work? Well, I think a lot of people have found their center or their space of sacred, right? In the men's room or the ladies' room for a deep breath, right? On the old porcelain god or goddess for 5 minutes. Just give me 5 minutes. In the broom closet. Help me to see what's going on. Sometimes we can get caught up in the winds of opposition. Rob is saying, I did that Monday and probably have to do it after the show is over. Yeah. I have a key to the server room. Holly is saying, I've run into opposition lately when being my own medical advocate. Oh, good. I will speak up when I know certain modality is not effective, even if the powers that be would rather I just go along with things. Yes. You have to be your own advocate. Right on, Holly. Janet is saying, this is so poignant right now. I'm so glad about that, Janet. Thank you. And Laura is saying, true story, in the bathroom, spirit is everywhere to help us, even in there. Yeah. Right. Sometimes the winds of opposition really are here to teach us. How far do you want to go? And a lot of times when we're being challenged into the what's next, it is the feeling of anxiety. It is the doubting Thomas in the brain. And when those moments come, I say to people, stop asking advice from people, right, that you just shouldn't be asking for advice from. People who have no benefit. Or stop listening to people that you would never ask for advice from. In the moments of opposing forces, seek your own inner counsel or somebody that you trust to get advice from. And don't listen to the voices of those people who have an opinion. Everybody's got opinions. Seek your own wise counsel. Janet is saying, I'm experiencing some health issues at the moment, and I think much of it is a manifestation about my indecisiveness and emotional turmoil. It is amazing what our inner thoughts, our inner workings do to our physical body. Yeah. And you're right, that is some awesome awareness. Slowing down, finding center. What's the worst thing that can happen if I say yes? What's the worst thing that can happen if I say no? When Elise graduated from nursing school and she was approached from the Children's Hospital to become a neonatal intensive care unit, also known as a NICU nurse, right? There were some opposing forces in her thoughts and in her mind. Mom, why does this happen? Well, it's a self-check. It's a self-check. Are you ready for this? Are you ready for this? Because you're walking into very deep territory, my love, as a NICU nurse. It's not just about your skills in nursing. These little beings that you will be with every day have just arrived on the earth plane to embrace their journey. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, I keep forgetting about that part, Mom." So these little tiny beings that have just appeared here, right? They just got their flesh and bones going, and they're having some troubles getting started. You're here for them with your medical knowledge, your nursing skills, and who you are as a woman, a spiritual woman. What are you going to do with that? How are you going to handle that? Okay, I get it, Mom. So sit with that, Elise. Sit with that. Be with that. Why do these things happen? For a pause, I think for a pause. And I think as we get older, I feel that as we get older, we consider the pause first before we go headlong into. And that's something we learn as a quadruple Scorpio. It took me a while to learn the importance of the pause. Do we have to attack back? No. We don't have to attack back, as Rob alluded to. We can, if we choose to do that, understanding what the ramifications are of that when we're talking about spirituality and spiritual practices. How do we handle ourselves in those situations? Do we go into the fray? Do we eventually say, just stop? Yeah, sometimes just stop. We don't have to be the doormat for the winds of opposition. We should never be the doormat for anything. Sometimes I think the winds of opposition show up so that maybe we don't go to what's next. Think about it for a half a minute, Dana, before you go there and do that. Just think about it for a half a minute. Look something else up. Do a little more research. Look into it a little further, Dana, and then decide. Oh. Those are really good winds of opposition, right? That make us sit for a little minute, and maybe we decide, nope, I'm not going there. I'm not doing that. Or maybe what we come to the conclusion is, I'm going to go there, but I'm going to take a different route. Maybe there's another avenue. The pause. Those moments of grace, if when we take them, Creator, universe, call it what you will, helps to guide us. to center us. Not all opinions are equal. Hey, Carla Joe. Laura is saying sometimes when we don't attack back, it takes the winds right out of the sails. Yep, it sure does, Laura. Rob is saying counterattack is always the tragedy of a single tempo, to paraphrase Alexander Alekhine. I don't know if I said that right. Alekhine. Sometimes practicing the pause when the winds of opposition, sometimes you have to do some quick thinking though, right? When the winds of opposition are quick, sometimes you have to do some quick thinking. You don't have time for a really long pause. Sometimes the winds of opposition can show up in a conversation at your dinner table. And some you let go. And others, I think, are opportunity for conversation. And others you let go because it's just not worth it. You consider the source, right? We say, well, we consider the source. I considered the source, and you know what, God, it just wasn't even worth saying anything. And other times the winds of opposition come right out of somebody's mouth, and it's an opportunity for conversation or a deeper discussion. Sometimes it is the winds of opposition in our own brain. Some people kind of sort of think themselves to death. Think. Whew. Can smell the rubber burning from a mile away. I'm married to an overthinker, and he admits that he's an overthinker. Not that I'm an underthinker, but I definitely kind of roll with I just roll. I probably could, tighten up on that a little bit. Kind of a rolly. I don't get uptight the same way a lot of other people do, especially after having a left brain stroke. People get their knickers in a knot, and I think, really? Your knickers are in a knot over that? Huh. You need to almost die at least once, I think, in every lifetime to kind of loosen up a bit. The pause. Sometimes the oppositional forces also find their way to us so that they can learn grace. They can learn compassion. How about thinking about it that way? Oppositional winds or oppositional forces making their way to us like a moth to a flame to learn about grace, compassion, understanding, forgiveness. How do we hold ourselves? The seen and the unseen worlds are very real. I have known that since I was a very little girl. I don't remember a time in my life where I didn't know that. I may not have understood it, but I knew it to be my reality. Always. And not even the people around me understood it, but they knew it was my reality to know that the unseen and the seen worlds are very much alive, coexisting, operating simultaneously, and both are available for us on this human journey. Sometimes the prevailing winds on the journey are oppositional, and we have to adjust our sails. Sometimes we have to just forge ahead, steam ahead. Sometimes we have to fire a cannon back. Right? And sometimes on the journey, we just have to be in a state of grace between both worlds to fully appreciate and understand what's being brought to us. If the winds of opposition are saying, there's no hope, this is hopeless, it's never going to get better, you can either join that whirlwind or tornado or thought bubble and accept that and add to it, feed the belly of that, or you can get centered and say, wait a minute, there's always hope. There's always goodness. There's always love. There's always light. And as Albus Dumbledore said, if one remembers to turn the light on. Sometimes the oppositional forces show up in our lap, so we're the one who turns on the light and says, wait a minute. This is what got your knickers in a knot? Here, let's shed a little light on that wind of opposition. Let's deflate it for a moment. Let's turn on the light. Sometimes the winds of opposition come to us in order to find rest, to be laid to rest. You ever find yourself in a conversation with somebody who's so anxiety-ridden, right? They're twisting and turning in their thoughts or their perceptions. It's amazing how perceptions gain steam, right? Our perception of a situation, our perception of what somebody said or wrote or texted or what have you. We can be lost in the winds of a perception. And we can find ourselves in the company of somebody lost in a perception, which has become their reality. And we are the person who soothes that by helping to reframe something. They're so lost in the forest. They can't see the trees. I remember one time, Linda Grizak, you were there with me at Sundance, and it was so hot. The opposition that day was 106 degrees in the burning sun of South Dakota at a Sundance. And we needed wind. We needed a cool wind. And the Sundance chief stopped the ceremony and he went out to the tree, the sacred tree. And he called to the wind. And he told us all to hang on to our hats, so to speak. And it was a good thing he did, because the wind that kicked up just by him talking to the spirit of the wind, Tate Wakan, the holy wind, the wind kicked up. And it was cool. And it gave us a new perspective of the day. Sometimes the winds give us a new perspective in that pause. And I also remember being out at my sister Barbara's place, and it was so windy we could hardly communicate with one another. It was so windy. And I looked at Barbara and I said, can't you ask the wind to stop? You're the elder. Can you ask the wind to stop, Chue? And she did. She said, well, yeah, I can do that. And she asked the wind to stop. It was really quite something on both ends of that spectrum. Carla Joe is saying, we're water. You're water. We tend to let it flow. Yes. Yeah. I am a flowy, quadruple flowy. Linda is saying, time for celebration of coming to earth in the NICU really helped me with the physical healing. Yeah. Right on, Linda. Pick your battles. That's right, Laura. That's me at the moment. The opposing forces. And, if somebody or something is sending to you oppositional forces on purpose, the old adage, what goes around comes around, it does. And that's usually where gaslighting occurs. That's where the gaslighting occurs. You don't have to say a thing for what goes around to come on back around, for the wheel to roll. You just, there you are. You just need to be in the center of your universe, connected to Grandmother Earth, connected to who you know you are, connected to your ancestors, the well ones, the illuminated ones, the wise ones, connecting. And we can watch that whirlwind, that Wamini Yumini, kick up a big old, oh my goodness. What goes around comes around wind. What goes around always comes back around. And some people, get impatient. Well, why hasn't that happened already? Well, everything has its own time. Sometimes it has to build up a head of steam. Right? Sometimes it has to be a great big nor'easter blowing back. I don't know. But as you get older, you just know. And as you get older, you take a lot less crapola as well. Knock it off. Sometimes we have to say knock it off. We don't have the opportunity to say it face to face, so we can say knock it off, higher self to higher self. Cut the crap. Sometimes we know oppositional forces are visiting us because we get glimpses of it in our dreams. I did the other night. I had this dream. And in the dream, there was a person in the dream who I have not seen in years. And she came into the dream. Her hair was looking actually quite like Joaquin, like thunder, lightning-ish, Joaquin artistry. It was like long ribbons with dots like the snow in the rain was her hair. Almost kind of like an old Raggedy Ann doll, that kind of a thing. And in the dream, she looked at me and she said, "Do you want to know what they're saying about you? Do you want to know what this person is saying about you?" And in my dream, I was very conscious in my dream. I said, no, I really don't. And I let spirit take care of that. I let spirit take care of that. And in my dream, knowing, I was very conscious of this dream, in that moment, one of my spiritual allies came into the dream, and I saw the person that this other was speaking of. And I watched my spiritual ally take those words from that person. And off he went, my ally, with those words that were being spoken about me. Oppositional words. Sometimes opposition comes from family. Sometimes it comes from family members that are disassociated from you. Sometimes it comes from family members that are right up close and personal. It can be surprising where those things come from. And in those cases, it's all individual how we handle that. Do we feed into it? Do we let spirit handle it? It's like the time that I asked Arval Looking Horse, so Arval, how come there's not a better business bureau for medicine people? He said there is one. It's called Spirit. Spirit takes care of people who are practicing bad medicine. And I think that that's true, both in the seen and the unseen. Sometimes we need a little human intervention. We can speed that along on the earth plane or simultaneously with spirit. How badly do we want to get to the next? Are we ready for the next on our spiritual journey? Sometimes oppositional forces send a red flag, right? The old red flag. Oh my God, I saw that red flag and I ignored it. Oh. Opposing forces aren't always a bad thing. They're opposing our thought or what we desire to have happen. So it's an opposition of what we desire. So the wind of opposition will send a red flag. Sometimes it's a subtle red. Sometimes it's really bright red. And it's up to us whether or not we consider it, act upon it, don't act upon it. And again, finding our place in the center, asking for a sign. Making those columns, right? I taught my kids that when they were young. What's the worst thing that could happen? What's the best thing that could happen? Let's list those things. If an opposing force is showing up, you're being asked to stop and to consider something. Consider a relationship, consider your thought process, consider your fear, consider your self-doubt, consider your feelings of worthiness. I am worth it. Shut up, doubting Thomas in my head. I am worth it. Sometimes it shows up to say, you know what, you need to stop being on that gossip train. Stop it. Not only stop it, maybe you're being asked to intervene. Sometimes it shows up to maybe reconsider our position about something. Maybe we've never considered something before because maybe it was never part of our growing up. You know, what we were taught as children. Sometimes oppositional forces show up to help us with childish thinking and childlike thinking. Has that ever happened? Yeah, but when I was a kid, I was taught X, Y, and Z. How can this be? When I was a kid, my mom taught me that. So how could this be? You're wrong. Sometimes oppositional forces are really opportunities dressed up as opposition. And we just have to, take the mask off. And that happens when we get centered. The mask falls off, the opposition. Sometimes when you ask, who is it? What is it? What is this opposition? Show me its face. And sometimes the face is an energy. It's a thought bubble. It could be a person. It could be a place, etc. It could be a memory that is a wind of opposition, a memory that perpetuates itself, an antiquated belief system dressed up as the winds of opposition. And you begin to take the mask off. Well, it's not really a wind of opposition at all. It's a wind of change. I thought it was a wind of opposition. It's a wind of change. It's time to change my thoughts, what I consider. Oh, huh. Sometimes we rail against those winds of opposition only to find out really we're railing against the winds of change. And winds of change create thunderstorms in our own brains, don't they? Sometimes in our families and our circles of friends, change. But it's always been done that way. Okay, well, maybe it's time to do it this way. Maybe there's another way. Maybe there's a funner way. Maybe there's a more joyful way. Just because it's always been done that way? Oh my gosh, long time ago, I was at Sundance with my sister Barb and my brother Guy. And that particular medicine man, Wichashawa Khan, in his Western door, he used the color blue rather than black. He used the color blue for the Wakian, the thunder people, the star people. Oh my goodness. The winds of opposition that literally showed up inside his ceremony caused a flood. I kid you not. The whole ceremony was flooded out eventually. There was so much wind of opposition for this young medicine man using the color blue in the Western door rather than the color black. All this winds of opposition. And I remember speaking to one of the elders who was so upset she could hardly speak. That this new way of looking at the Western door would include the color blue, because blue is the color of the stars. It's the color of above. There was no room in her traditional mind that maybe it could also be blue. Maybe it was a new way of looking at things. But black is the main one. She was beside herself. Black is the main one. And pretty soon the head of steam, regarding all of those kinds of sort of thoughts, blew right into his Sundance. He had to call it off early. So the question then is, was he doing it wrong because he had blue at the Western door? Or was he being tested in his belief or his understanding, his communication with Spirit? And in his communication with his Spirit allies and helpers, Spirit said to him, your Western door, you will use the color blue. It didn't stop him. He continued on the next year, and he still continues to this day to practice that way. So for him, it was a test. It didn't stop him. He became more earnest in doing and working with Spirit in the way that he works with Spirit, the way he conducts himself spiritually or religiously. Yesterday, I was having a great meeting with the Native Justice Coalition yesterday afternoon. We were having a meeting about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. And it was a group of people from Wisconsin, Michigan, northern Michigan, this side of Michigan. It was just a phenomenal group of people about the work we're all doing in unison with one another for murdered and missing Indigenous people. And we had this great discussion because some of the people working on this particular issue happened to be members of a church, a particular branch of Christianity. And somewhere in our conversation with one another, we began this conversation about, rather than being oppositional Why can't we work together? And maybe we can have some really great conversations about Christianity and indigenous people all over the world without it feeling oppositional. Having good conversation, and maybe in those good conversations, taking a look at ways of collaborating and learning about perspectives rather than just getting our grundies in a wad, feeling attacked. Oh, it was great conversation. Todd said to me, boy, it sounded like you were having a really good meeting yesterday. It went on for 2 hours, mostly about missing and murdered Indigenous women, but it rolled into this other because there was the kind of the elephant in the room that we're having a talk about Indigenous topics and colonialism, and where does colonialism stem from, and Christianity and cultures around the world you get the idea. And it wasn't oppositional, it was wonderful conversation. And how do we sometimes walk both? Why does it have to be oppositional? To be one and the other, to have 2 feet. One in Christianity and one on the Pipe Road or the Red Road, or one in the Celtic Circle and one in the church pew or the synagogue. Why does it have to be oppositional? Maybe the day and the age is here in Aquarius where it doesn't have to be opposition, it can be collaboration. And the opposition is the rub that says you need to take a deeper look at or reconsider, or maybe look at it in a new way, or let it go. Maybe it's no longer for you. In the deeper look, you say, oh, ooh, yikes, Those oppositional winds are they're gift bringers. The Wakian Oyate, the Tate Oyate, the wind nation, the winds in our minds, the winds in our heart, the winds that blow out in nature. They're gift bringers if we look at it that way. The gift of clear sight. If you're somebody who likes to work with the angelics and you're needing some clear insight, the Archangel Saint Uriel helps with clear-sightedness. The hawk, Cheta Oyate, hawk helps us to see clearly. Help me to see what this wind is bringing. What is the wind bringing? What is the gift in here? Hey, Del. Wind is the breath of life for everything. If the good Lord wanted us to look at things in a new way, he wouldn't have made me so hard-headed. That's funny. Hey, Chue, you know. Those oceans and tides of emotions. If we have a really high tide or we have a choppy sea, that's usually because there are some winds. So if our emotions are kicked up, it's because there's a wind that kicked them up. What's the wind? Why is the wind churning our emotions? Doesn't Saint Raphael also help with clear sight? He sure does. Once I was blind and now I see. And that's a good point, Rob, because when we want to see, when we desire to see the gift of the winds that are churning our emotions or our thoughts or having us look at things differently in a new way, we have to be prepared for what we're going to see or perceive or come to understand or come to know. Once I was blind and now I see. conversion of Saul into Paul. Aha. Aha. And as we get older, we come to learn that, people are people. And if somebody keeps blowing the same wind your way, you don't have to continue to accept it. Take your blustering and go somewhere else with it. I'm not accepting that here any longer. I don't accept that. I don't accept the winds of your opinion. I'm done with that. Take your windiness elsewhere. But if we ask to see, if we really want to see the root of anything in our lives, including our own stuff, we want to see the root, Lordy, we need to be prepared. Raphael, help me to see. Why is this thought continuing to spin around in my mind? Why does this circumstance keep happening to me? Why? Well, you haven't learned from the first, several winds of that the several wet red flags that have been blowing in your life. You haven't paid attention to those red flags, just like the choppy sea flags, right? We either pay attention to those lifeguard flags or we don't. We go into that riptide anyway. You saw the flag. I keep sending the flag. I keep sending winds to make it flap. You're not paying attention. Get still. Take a look. Ooh. Find your center. All of us are walking between heaven and earth. All of us, whether we believe it or not, whether we understand it or not. The seen and the unseen worlds are very real. They're very alive. They're happening simultaneously. This human journey, I believe, is a gift. It's not always a pleasant gift. Sometimes we want to give it back. Sometimes the winds don't allow us to even open up all the gifts that we were originally born with, as Hafiz says. I ask you to consider that when the winds of opposition show up, that you take a moment, take a breath. Center yourself with your ancestors, with your spiritual allies, whatever that is for you. To hold yourself there. To look, to see, to consider, to reconsider. Sometimes we have to learn to bend when the wind shows up. Sometimes that's the teaching of the wind of opposition. The winds of change disguised as opposition. The wind is showing us how to bend like a willow tree. To be fluid. Teaching us that the deeper our roots, the stronger the winds that we can sail with, ride upon, experience. If we don't have deep roots, we're going to topple over. To be flexible. Some people just want it their way. And by God, it's going to happen their way no matter what. So the opposing forces will show up for us to consider flexibility. That's the gift. That's the gift. With that, everybody, thank you for joining me this morning. Get out there and shine your light. If opposing forces, whether they are the winds of change dressed up, whatever they are, the winds of your own thoughts, I encourage you to take a moment today to get centered, have a look-see, to consider and reconsider, and keep on shining your light. Next week, it is Exploring Sacred, followed by Dear Miss T, and Terry will be with us to talk about gaslighting. With that, everybody, have a gorgeous day.